I want to do before we get started, and we can modify and adjust this, because more than likely, unless you actually attended a new school, from what I understand, most of you are probably in a position where you're trying to get your first teaching position. So knowing about a new school may not be as important to you as, okay, what can I expect when I get my first job? What's it going to be like? What's going to happen, and what do I need to do? So we can shift, if you like, from what it's like to open a new school to what's it like for me, or what can I expect in my first job, if you want to do that. That's up to you. That's why I didn't really have something as far as handouts or PowerPoints, because I wanted to wait and see who's in my group, who's in the crowd. So if you have specific things that you want to know about, would you please come up on the board and write them down? Do you have anything? And that way we can make sure that we cover them. If you don't, that's okay.
Are you opening it now, or?
Yeah, you can come up, and that way we can make sure that we cover what's important to you, because I can stand here and give you 36 years of experience, but it may not even touch what you're interested or want to know about. And that's what this is about. It's about you, it's not about me. Questions? Good questions. I want this time to be valuable for you, because you had a lot of good opportunities to attend several different sessions. And if during the time we're spending together talking, you have any questions you think of, you're welcome to write them down or take them down. Let me give you a very short biographical sketch. I retired in July 2013 after 36 years in education. I had 3 years coaching and teaching on the college level. Had the opportunity to begin from the very beginning a track and cross-country program at the University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where I graduated. I had an opportunity to spend 2 years coaching basketball and volleyball at what then was known as the University of Northeast Louisiana University in Monroe, Louisiana, which is now the University of Louisiana Monroe. Both NLU was extremely successful. When I was there, we went to the NCAA, we won the conference championship, played on national television in the NCAA tournament. So I've had some experience doing things and beginning a program from the very beginning where we had no scholarships, no money, almost nothing. That lent itself to help me when I was in a position as a middle school teacher or a high school teacher to go to middle school. I have 10 years high school experience teaching and coaching. The last year, the high school I was working at closed and consolidated with another high school, the big rival in town. I didn't have seniority, so I was moved to the middle school. I had no clue about middle school. I had no clue about middle school at all. And I went to the principal and I said, I'll give you a year, and if I don't like it, I'm going back to high school. And he said, fair enough. Well, that was in 1990, and I was in middle school the rest of the time. I was an assistant principal for 14 years. I was a principal for 6 years. I had an opportunity, the first middle school that I worked at was a brand new school. And then 8 years ago, I had an opportunity to open a middle school, a brand new facility. So I've kind of been around, had a lot of different experiences. The only level that I haven't worked at is elementary. That's the only level. So I have no experience at all there. With this in mind, one of the things that I need to tell you, I wish someone had told me when I first started. 2 things you need to really do, and this is something that I did with all the staff, and I talk to them almost weekly, especially young people. When you get your first job, and we'll talk about the interview because that's something everybody asks about. What questions should I ask? What should I expect? What are you looking for? How can I tell? And we were just having a conversation about that, about a first-year teacher that I had at another school. You need to make sure you start saving for your retirement. I know when you begin, money's going to be very tight, and that's going to be the last thing on the list. But you need to start saving for your retirement from the very beginning. It doesn't matter if it's $10 or $15 or $20 a month. You need to make sure you take care of yourself. And very few people are going to tell you that. They won't talk to you about that. It was 1994 before I started saving for retirement. And I retired in 2013. So now I'm in a position where I don't have nearly the funds I should have had. The other thing is this. Personally, school, I graduated in the summer, and all the schools were getting ready to start in about 3 weeks, and I had no interviews lined up, none. I was freaking out. I was nervous, I was scared, I was concerned, am I going to have a chance? Is somebody going to talk to me at least? In a matter of 4 days, I went from no potential interviews to 5 interviews. In a matter of 8 days, I had 3 job offers. So I went from, am I going to have a job, to, oh my gosh, which job do I take? Which one's the best one for me? Those are, and I share this with you because those are very different, but they're very similar. You go from, oh my gosh, am I going to have an interview, to, oh my gosh, which job do I take? If you ever go and interview, and you're sitting in the interview, and a principal starts pushing you right then to sign a contract, you need to get up and walk away. Because you need to look at things and talk to people after an interview. Don't let anybody push you into something you really don't want to do. Okay? Don't let anybody do you that way. One of the top teachers I ever had the privilege and opportunity to have teach and work with me is from here. And she was a top graduate at her, and during her time here. She worked with the president and earned a master's degree. And I realized, didn't need to push her, she needed time to make her decision. Well, it was a job fair in Atlanta, and I went 3 hours before the job fairs opened to meet a potential media specialist from Arkansas. and talk to her before anybody else had an opportunity to. Kathleen Gilreath, who is now Kathleen Hunter, who was here. If you ask around, you probably know about her. She came to that job fair, and I talked to her a little bit, and I walked her over and introduced her to somebody from the system I was working in. And the lady said, well, you need to hurry up and sign with us. And I turned to the lady from the central office, and I said, no, she doesn't. She needs to go talk to all these other places. That way she can make her mind up. I never approached her about it. I said, you're very good. We'd love to have you, but you make your decision. You get back in touch with me when you're ready, and we'll talk seriously. And I never talked to her again. We went to lunch over here at the Mexican place one day when I came one summer. And she was telling Dr. Mizell, said, well, I don't think he likes me. He didn't talk to me very much. I don't talk a lot. I listen and I watch, and I learn a lot about people. But anyway, she was the second person to agree to teach at the school, Factory Shores Middle School, where I retired as principal. The first teacher that I recommended was also from here. In 3 years, there were 7 teachers from this university that I hired at our school. So I share that with you because you need to know that when you walk out of here, you're extremely well prepared, and you know a lot more than a lot of other people. In the 6 years I was principal, we had 9 teachers from here. You also need to know that the first year our school was open, we had 21 first-year teachers in our building. That's unusual. Most people don't hire that many first-year teachers. But I had a plan about how. You need to, when you go to interview, you need to ask some of the questions like, what's the makeup of the staff? In other words, I was looking for about 33% of our staff to have between 1 and 5 years experience, and about 33% of the staff to be between 8 and 15 years, and then about 33% of the staff to have 15 years and more. We had teachers from 38 states in our building. That wasn't by accident. From all the way from Los Angeles, California, to Harvard, Massachusetts, the Bahamas, Jamaica, everywhere, because I wanted our students to be exposed as much as possible. When you go in for an interview, you need to be prepared by going on the school website and ask specific questions about, ask the principal, what's your philosophy about academics? What do you have in place for beginning teachers? I was sharing with Lemmies that we had a situation where every one of our teachers, especially beginning teachers, had a mentor on their team, they had a mentor on their grade level, and they had a mentor in the building, and they had an administrator that also worked with them. Okay? They weren't out on an island by themselves. Now let me step back and tell you this. When I began in 1977, I was the worst teacher that could have ever stepped in a classroom. Absolutely horrible. I don't know how I survived. I thought if you intimidated people, especially in high school, they would do what you wanted. I was absolutely horrible. But let me tell you my experience, and this helped me when I became a principal. My principal, my first school, walked up to me and handed me my textbook and the key to my room and said, your room's down the hall, now go do your job. And I didn't see him for 4 weeks. Another thing that we've done at every school I've ever worked at is so many young teachers have told me, I don't know how you knew, but when I needed you the most or needed help, you were always outside the door. You were always there. You knew when to step in. That's because I'd been there. I knew what it was like. I didn't forget that. So it's very, very important. when you get ready to interview, when you get ready to send out your resume and everything, go somewhere and buy the most professional paper you can find and make sure your resume is top notch. Because I can't tell you how many photocopies I got with misspelled words, incorrect information, and things like that that I looked at and tossed in the trash can. Okay? You want yours to be so well done and so professional looking that that alone is going to get you a second look. The more information you put on your resume as far as experiences you've had, whether you sponsored this or you worked as a counselor at a church camp or anything like that, that talks about it and lets somebody know more about you, the better off you are. There's a rule about your resume shouldn't be longer than 1 page. I never looked at that. I wanted as much information as possible. When I shared with you about the staff that we had at Factory Shoals, we had 2 assistant principal positions, and I checked the resumes of over 400 applicants for those 2 positions, and I interviewed 10 people. You ask a question, and some of the stuff up here about what should we look at when choosing schools to apply to. Talk to people that are at that school if you know. Go to the website. One of the very best things that you can do right now, and it's for you, it's not that big an expense, is to join GMSA. And the reason I say that to you is not to promote the organization that I'm humbly and proud of being the executive director, but you get to interact with so many people, and for $20 a year, that's a steal. Just like if you were to come up to me and say, Mr. Allen, I'm thinking about so-and-so and so-and-so. What do you know about them? More than likely, I know somebody there. More than likely, I do. It will also give you an opportunity to interact with people and find out and talk to people. What are you looking for when you apply to a school? What are you looking for? Whatever's important to you and what you feel like, okay, I want administration that's going to be supportive. I want to work somewhere where I can grow professionally. I want to work somewhere where they care about kids. Because one of the things you're going to find out is a lot of times decisions are made based not on what's best for students, but on money and what it costs. That's something you have to know. Yes, ma'am.
Should we ask these questions after we have an offer from that school? So if we're going in and start asking them questions during our interview, is that going to be taken as like disrespect?
Did everybody hear her question? It never bothered me during the interview. It never bothered me for someone to ask questions. You don't want to wait until they offer. Okay? If you're in an interview and you have one person or a panel of people asking you questions, if they don't give you an opportunity to ask them questions, you need to say, is it okay if I ask you some questions, some things I've jotted down? And since we've had a conversation, I have some other questions that I would like to ask. And if, excuse me, if that interview panel won't grant you that, then that's probably not somewhere you want to work.
Wow.
Because that tells you right then they're not really open and it's more dictatorial. I've been in an interview panel where there was only one person. I was on an interview panel one time when I was interviewing for a position with 3 people, and they took turns and they asked me a total of 100 questions. I was also on an interview panel with 22 people, and they went around and around and around, and the interview itself lasted 2 hours and 48 minutes. So when you set up the interview, you may want to ask them, what's it going to be like? How many people are going to be on the panel? that kind of thing. Okay? All right, let's look at another question. Qualities you look for in hiring teachers. The potential teachers that I hired from here, I never asked them more than 3 questions because I knew as far as preparation, they're heads and tails above everybody else. I had one person who, while she was here, having to do her paper, her supervising professor left and went and took another job, and she was by herself. She finished that and got one of the highest grades on that any student here had gotten. My question for her, and the only question I asked her in the interview was, she made straight A's in high school and straight A's in college. My question to her was, how are you going to help a student who is not successful? Because you've been successful all your life. How are you going? And she had a problem with that. It took her 3 years to get to a point where she could really understand what that was like. So, also you may say, well, is it important for me to go in with all A's? When I interviewed for my first job, I got my first job, principal looked and said, well, I'm glad to see you. You had an F and you had a C. That tells me that you struggled, but I see you went back and took the class again and you passed. Not everybody gets it the first time. So that's something to keep in mind. What should you ask in an interview? There's really only one thing that's off limits. Number one is salary, because that will be based on the system that you're interviewing from. And you can get that information on the system website. The main thing about interviews when you go is to do as much research and know as much about that school as you possibly can before you go in there. That's very, very important. Good questions. Is having a master's degree better than a BA on your first year teaching? Not necessarily. Because I'm going to tell you something. You're now doing your internship and you're doing things like that. But when you walk in that classroom and you close that door for the first time and you're there by yourself, it's a totally different game, folks. It's all different. You're on that island. Is it better? Not necessarily. I never looked at and hired or didn't hire somebody. Some systems don't hire people with higher degrees because they have to pay a higher salary. 10 or 15 years ago, systems would pay their teachers for advanced degrees. If you're a board certified teacher, that's another situation. A lot of systems now won't pay for that. So that's not necessarily a negative or a positive. I've had teachers that have started with us, with me, that had a BA, and after a couple of years say, I want to go back, and I said, okay. But it's going to be a big adjustment when you go in our classroom and start working full time. It's very different. Qualities I look for in hiring a teacher, I've already told you. I want somebody well-rounded. They don't necessarily have to have the greatest GPA, but I want to know how many experiences they've had. And I'm going to tell you one of the questions that I ask most of the people I interviewed, give me an example of something that didn't go right. How did you know it didn't go right? And what did you do to change it so that your students were able to be successful or learn? I went in once and to evaluate a veteran teacher that I'd worked with at another school, and we both moved to a different school. And the lesson she was teaching in math bombed. She was horrible. It was bad. I didn't say anything. I sat there for about 45 minutes. I got up the next day and I went back in that class, same time, with the same teacher. I went in there to see, okay, what what's she gonna do differently? And when the kids walked in, she met them at the door. And she said, come in and have a seat. And she said, before you get your books out or we do anything, I need to tell you something. And she sat right down with them and got very personal with them and said, yesterday I did a very poor job of teaching the lesson. You didn't understand it, it was my fault. You are all smart enough to know how to do this, and together we're gonna go over it again, and you will be able to learn, and you will learn the material, and I will help you. Now, does anybody have any questions about yesterday? And it was like she wiped the slate clean, she accepted responsibility and went on. That's what a really good educator does. Because in essence, if they're not learning, guess who's responsible for that? The teacher. So there's a reason. How do we stand out as teacher candidates? I'm very traditional and very old-fashioned. I'm looking for people that are dressed professionally, people that understand what a professional appearance is. You don't have to wear high-dollar clothes, but you also don't want to wear a wrinkled shirt or a blouse that looks like you slept in it. And for God's sakes, when you go for an interview, don't chew gum. Please don't do that. Some people freak out when you sit down and you're across the table from people. They get upset if you put items that you may have with you on their desk. I never had that problem when people interviewed with me. But I was very direct and very specific in interviews. I told them very specifically what I'm going to do. Obviously, the goal of that interview was for me to determine if they were the person that was best suited to fill a position at our school. Second goal was that for that person to find out if our school was where they wanted to work. And I was very direct. Everybody ever interviewed with me, we had written questions. We had 3 questions they had to answer in 10 minutes. And I checked spelling and I checked grammar. Because you got to be able to think and write. You got to be able to communicate. Grammar was very important to me also. So those are some characteristics I look for. I want someone who's willing. I gave you the name of Kathleen Gilreath. In 3 years, she taught 3 different subjects. And from the first year she was a first-year teacher with us, she served as a grade level chair on her team and also represented our grade level. That's a lot of responsibility for a first-year teacher. But she was also one of our teachers of the year. And she finished up 2 years in a row in 4th overall for teacher of the year. In our building, I told you about the staff we had. We had 38 teachers. We had teachers from 38 different states. We had 21 teachers that were teachers of the year for their school or their system, and 1 teacher was teacher of the year in 2 different systems. Our first ever teacher of the year at Factory Shoals was selected teacher of the year for the county, for Douglas County School System. Now that created a lot of problems. Can you imagine how people felt with a first-year school just opened, and here's a guy from Los Angeles, Douglas County Teacher of the Year? There was a lot of animosity, a lot of issues. Best piece of advice for a prospective teacher during and after before the interview. Number 1, before you go in, take a deep breath and relax and be yourself. That's another thing I always told people. I said, if you're expecting to come in here and have me just overwhelm you and intimidate you, you're going to be disappointed, because that's not the way I interview. I'm not that way. I don't want you falling out on the floor and me having to do CPR. And that way they did what you just did. They laughed or they smiled and they were relaxed. And I always had a bottle of water, and I'd always say, would you care for a bottle of water before we get started? Do you need to go use the restroom before we get started? And while they were answering the 3 questions, I was checking their resume. But I already knew about the resume, and I'd already checked on them before they ever came to interview, or they would have been interviewing with me. One of the other things I want to tell you, I told you the number of teachers for Teacher of the Year. One of the other things I'm very proud of the staff of the school I was principal. In 6 years, we had 2 assistant principals who became principals. We had 4 teachers who became assistant principals, and we had 2 teachers who became instructional lead teachers. That's in 6 years. That may not mean much to you, but there are a lot of schools that never produce leaders. And so that's something I'm very, very proud of. Let's see, any other questions? The interview. How long will the interview last? It kind of depends. Normally you're in with 2 or 3 people. What I like to do is I like to have our team leader and another assistant principal a lot of times interview with me after I interview them the first time. And one of the things that I always did in interviews, after I asked questions and talked specifically, was I would say, do you have any questions you would like to ask me? I was very direct and specific about how the interview process would be. Before we actually started, the person I was interviewing knew exactly what was going to happen. There's more to it than just asking questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question that I didn't put up there, but I was wondering, like, what exactly, how does the transition happen from, like, being a teacher to an administrator or a principal?
One of the things that we were able to do at Factory Shoals was we were able to provide our staff, our teachers, with experiences and opportunities, leadership type opportunities to give them an experience. I recently had a friend of mine who's also a retired principal. His father died in Warner Robins, and I went to the funeral, to the visitation, and I had